Hello and welcome to the Big Rethink brought to you by Newcities. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay, Director of Research. Today is September 18th, 2020. Coronavirus deaths in the United States approach the tragic threshold of 200,000, while worldwide deaths are at 946,000 today. I'm joined later in the podcast by my guest, Jordan Davis, Director of Smart Columbus. We're going to have her on to talk a bit about how Columbus has weathered during the COVID pandemic and is one of the handful of American cities in the Sun Belt, thereabouts there in the lower Midwest, that is poised to benefit not only from people who are leaving cities, but also the climate change that is sweeping through us. That is the story of this week's Big Rethink. Let me scale myself down and scale my slides up. As we get into the discussion here, this is sort of the state of play at the moment here. It gives you an idea. Of course, wildfires in the West, with smoke traveling across much of North America and the continental United States, with multiple active storm systems out in the Gulf and North Atlantic, with Hurricane Sally having made landfall earlier this week, dumping torrential rain on Pensacola, Florida. Deaths were minor, of course, but still causing tremendous property damage. But this gives you an idea here of sort of the climate disasters that are rapidly descending on the United States of America. Here's a picture of the 5 active storm systems. We're already starting to wonder about how we will name tropical storms for the rest of this hurricane season once we run out of them. Of course, this was all predicted. This was known to be the busiest hurricane season since 2005, the year of Katrina. I, for one, if I have a dog in this particular fight, it's at Hurricane Teddy. My oldest son is named Teddy. I hope his name is not remembered as another disaster striking North America. Last week, of course, San Franciscans woke up to the unsettling specter of the skies having turned orange in a sort of Martian hue, the surreal glow created by the combination of wildfire smoke across much of the West, combined with the marine layer of the city to elevate the smoke particles and keeping them trapped there, creating the eerie effect of being able to walk outside without much smoke, but still seeing this. And of course, people capture these surreal images here. It will get brighter, a case for optimism. Here's one I found basically of illuminated trucks showing COVID protocol, while of course, staying inside because of that. So, highlighting the uncanny valley of the twin disasters. And this was much of the effect across much of California. Here, webcams from across the state showing exactly how much of that state and much of the West is on fire. Of course, fires around Seattle, Portland, and up and down the West Coast, leading to cities like Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland being the 3 worst cities in the world at the moment when it comes to air quality. And there are, of course, stories all over social media of people who have bought fans and filters and spent much of the last week or so barricaded inside their homes, desperately trying to keep the air quality indexes above 500, trying to keep it out of their homes. Now, this is sort of cues into, I've taken as of late to quoting Robert Frost, who wrote the poem Fire and Ice, thinking about sort of the twin disasters we're caught between of climate change and COVID. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. And from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. And this, of course, we've seen in the various sort of carbon emissions indexes that have happened since the pandemic began, where we saw in April a 17% global decline in greenhouse gas emissions, which have quickly rebounded as people have eschewed public transport and taken back to driving. And of course, the whole pop cultural riff in the United States that we should move out of dense cities with lower carbon footprints per capita to more ex-urban frontiers. So yes, I hold with those who favor fire. And of course, if you live in Colorado, last week you had the choice between the two, the combination of early snow in the mountains and wildfires on both sides, which is of course doubly ironic given that Denver is, one of the most popular cities in America for people moving to because of that desire to have both the combination of the city and nature. Now, as this was happening, Trump's own commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, put out its own blistering 200-page report warning of climate change as an existential risk to the United States financial system and a subsystemic risk, particularly to real estate. I bring this up because the editor of this report was Jesse Keenan, who is a professor at the University of Tulane, and he joined us this past week at Newcities at our Wellbeing Cities Forum. He was one of the panelists on a special session called Getting to Higher Ground, which is sort of a preview session of the Higher Ground Climate Migration Conference. Will be kicking off in December, Newcities' next project on this. And looking at situations like the one, as you can see in this slide here, where a year after placing a moratorium on basically preventing insurance companies from making homes in Central California uninsurable, we're now beginning to see the inevitable there, where the market is responding to these dangers, basically making it impossible to own a home there. And we're also seeing the effects of this potentially in coastal areas where flooding is creating permanent write-downs to the value of homes. Now, it's interesting. Brookings put out a report last year. This has recently resurfaced in the discourse about how basically climate change could, in theory, make the United States less polarized in its politics through climate migration. And you can sort of see here, that basically, yes, as you might expect, Florida and the Gulf Coast would be some of the areas that are expected to suffer some of the biggest hits in climate costs, while the Pacific Northwest will emerge relatively unscathed. But again, the wildfires have scrambled some of these scenarios. But we'll talk a bit about this with Jordan when she makes her appearance, because yeah, the Midwest, as you might imagine, is one of the areas poised to benefit. And this is an interesting piece in Speculative Design that Quartz published last week, imagining a climate migrant refuge on the Great Lakes in 2067 called Leaside. As you can sort of see here for a second, imagine this idealized future, and here's sort of highlighting the areas of climate risk. Now, we're hosting Higher Ground in Orlando, Florida, because Orlando is one of the few cities in the United States that has begun to think about what happens when climate migrants start moving to it rather than away from it. They're preparing to absorb an initial wave from South Florida, mostly as economic migrants at the moment, but climate change will continue to play into those decisions. Now, elsewhere, we have to touch upon New York because it's sort of an iron law that we have to see when talking about the future of cities. What happens to New York? We can see that last week, subway ridership reached crucial recovery level of 1.5 million riders. It's still imperative, of course, that the federal government provide bailout to public transit systems across the United States. We've seen, of course, a whole pushback on social media, people arguing that, the deaths of Manhattan in particular have been exaggerated, although Mayor Bill de Blasio enraged parents across the city this past week by basically pushing back school reopening dates, which, as others have pointed out, has been the case across much of the United States. All sorts of chaos about schooling, but there, the last large school system in the country that was committed to sending children back into physical classrooms, basically walked back its promise, at least temporarily. But this narrative here, of course, that people are going to flee New York City is, of course, overplayed. Here's a tweet by Ian Bremmer, the peripatetic geopolitical strategist, quoting some real estate data. I found this, that while single-family home prices in the Hamptons have risen incredibly fast, more than doubling, in Brooklyn, they've risen even faster. And this plays into my own personal take on this, reading the tea leaves and the data, that people want to have the best of all possible worlds. They want to have the largest possible urban home they can while still benefiting from those urban amenities. And this is the dynamic we've seen across the United States as people who are leaving coastal cities like Manhattan and like San Francisco are choosing to try to keep that urbanity while also keeping size. And of course, that is a relatively privileged piece of the population, because you can see in this study from the US Census Bureau that basically, yes, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to remote work, and of course, the more options you have. So this whole narrative of this flight from cities due to COVID, of course, driven by the wealthiest. And the perversity of this is that in New York, for example, my old neighborhood of Jackson Heights, Queens, is where they've actually seen some of the highest infection rates and an actual increase in rents. The places in New York where rents are falling are in the wealthiest neighborhoods like Tribeca, of course, because those are the ones ensconced in the Hamptons for the foreseeable future. So we're seeing this dynamic where, again, the K-shaped recovery of ongoing inequality playing out, where the wealthiest have the most options and the fastest recovery, and the poorest and the most affected by COVID are suffering the most. And this is a dynamic being seen across the country. Here's some data by Redfin, sort of backing up this hypothesis, showing that, yeah, the places that are seeing the fastest home sales and the fastest shrinking of housing inventory are cities like Baltimore and San Antonio, which sort of sit, you can imagine, at opposite ends of the sort of density spectrum, secondary cities in the shadow of Washington, D.C. and New York, and also, of course, the larger Texas coastal metros there, where you can basically sort of see out this desire to keep both the urban and sort of rural lifestyle all in one. And the New York Times sort of documented this fairly well last week, doing a satellite image photography and mapping it against basically political voters' leanings. And they argue that the United States is not blue and red, but is actually gray and green. Gray being the asphalt of the urban districts that went for Clinton in 2016, and green, of course, for the more rural areas that went for Trump. And when they actually sort of map this out here, you can not only see the huge amount of gray, but also the green, and at the very top, the blue. The notion of voters for Trump is in fact rooted in the data. So those of you who recall last week's Twitter amusement of a Trump voter armada on Lake Travis outside Austin being swamped in each other's wake, there is some actual truth to that. So on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce Jordan Davis, Director of Smart Columbus. Come on out from behind the virtual Zoom curtain there. Thank you for joining us, Jordan. You look like you're ready for some electric mobility there based on your own virtual.
Yes.
So how has Columbus been weathering the pandemic? I would say, have you noticed? Obviously, football is coming back. The Big Ten is going to be back in action at the end of October. But also, I mean, Columbus, from what I've seen, is one of those beneficiary cities. You know, an affordable Midwest city that people have their eye on. So, I'm sure there's of course been tragedy in the city during the pandemic. But are you also seeing the place as a refuge, or are people coming in?
I mean, I think you're getting at one of the biggest unknowns through COVID, which is this just a further exasperation of the tale of two cities? So is this a place where the white collar workforce remains employed, saving money, buying houses, moving back to be closer to family or more convenient of a lifestyle, and then are others being left behind in the essential workforce that hasn't had the luxuries of some of the convenience factors and benefits of COVID. So I think we're still learning this. I mean, we're still figuring it out. As you mentioned, in New York City, the changes that are happening there, the things are changing here all the time. As levels change, new things are closed. Are we going back to work? How does that impact downtown businesses? So our economy is very much, I think, we're iterating as we go. We've got unemployment numbers still historically low, but also a lot of jobs that are just going unfilled. And we're trying to figure out why, what the cause for that is, and try and build things back up.
Yeah, how is it? If I recall correctly, and you'll have to remind me, there's something particularly about the funding formulas of Ohio in particular that's going to leave its cities hard hit fiscally. I mean, we're seeing this across the United States. The federal government has withheld aid to the states and the cities, and so we're seeing the crunch and austerity budgets looming. And yeah, please refresh me and our viewers here on why Ohio in particular, those formulas are skewed. Where I know Cleveland and Cincinnati and some of the other classic Rust Belt cities are particularly vulnerable to this.
Yeah, so our our tax makeup, so the income to our city municipal governments are roughly 75, I think Columbus it's 78% of the budget. Mm-hmm. So in a remote work environment where your income tax is where you work, there's definitely some rules of uncertainty there about, we have a lot of downtown concentration. We've built infrastructure to support a very large workforce that comes downtown every day. But many of them live in the suburbs. And so where does that money go? But furthermore, it just, with the layoffs and other economic situations, it puts Columbus in a different position than weathering the storm with other tax models.
Interesting. Well, I would say, and also what have you seen in terms of Columbus, in terms of, are there any signs? Have you seen moving trucks arriving on every corner? I mean, if you read anecdotally these reports from Manhattan and particularly San Francisco, this notion that, that every remote worker is now fleeing for, perhaps nearby in the hills and the valleys, there are people who are, of course, being displaced by wildfires. But yeah, is there a noticeable influx of people from coastal cities into Columbus, or rethinking that as they get closer to family?
Well, I haven't really been out much, so I can't tell you if I'm seeing moving trucks, but I would say, the housing market is, going gangbusters here. So if that's any consolation, not sure if that is directly from renters, taking the leap to become a homeowner because they want their own space or more space, or if it's new residents entirely. I think it's probably a combination of both.
No. Well, interesting. How is your own work with mobility going? Obviously, for those of you who are unfamiliar with sort of Smart Columbus, the project comes out of a grant at the end of the Obama administration from Department of Transportation to rethink, basically urban mobility, electric, autonomous, all these things. Obviously, one of the whole stories of this pandemic has been people shying away from transit and other sort of shared modes. I mean, ride hailing, everything else. So this entire transit revolution has taken some interesting veers here. So how has Columbus grappled with that as well?
I mean, it's real. So every single project has been impacted in participation extremely, right? Just because such less movement is occurring. I think that it's been reinforcing of the role of public transportation and really being that essential transportation mode for so many residents and essential workers. And that's definitely been reinforced through this, but it's forced our entire system to innovate more. Our transportation authority, COTA, has gone to free fares. They're doing backboarding onto the buses. They're even looking at going into contactless payment very rapidly. So there are such advancements. They're expanding their on-demand microtransit services, which are moving less people, but obviously closer from point to point. And so I think there's a little bit, it's actually advanced the bigger agenda of reimagining transportation. Has participation rates in that reinvention been what we would have hoped at this point in time? No, but I think we're getting further toward a system kind of reimagining of the network and how it works faster.
Yeah. Well, one thing I remember that was going to come out of this is that, you were going to commit to basically deploying these technologies and services in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Columbus. Instead of waiting for them to trickle down, there was going to be a dedicated effort to this. And I remember Secretary Anthony Fox talking about, infant mortality and doctor's appointments there. How have you pivoted to that during the pandemic in terms of being able to deliver supplies, meals? Have you been able to use the technology to that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually deployed an autonomous shuttle in the Linden neighborhood, which is one of the lowest income neighborhoods in our community. And it was servicing the first mile, last mile solution from the transit stop to stopping at a community center, a housing development, and a kind of food bank or community center, St. Stephen's Community House. And through that, we stopped passenger service, obviously, and extended the pause of the pilot, but have positioned it now to deliver food. So instead of moving people, it's delivering food to the community on the route. And I think that that's a good shift in use case of keeping the technology running, but making it serve a really practical and needed use case within this current condition. We also expanded micro-mobility service into the neighborhood as part of our smart mobility hubs. And I think what's really interesting about that is we've seen ridership of micro-mobility increase pretty comprehensively across the community, and to bring that access closer into the neighborhoods, I think is a win-win as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I would say, is Columbus engaged in sort of a slow streets program as well, or has it been thinking about how it reimagines public space? Or I would say, are there images like the ones we saw in New York of all the outside dining?
We were a little late, to be fair, a little late to the game. We've just allowed outdoor dining, an expansion, so like kind of annexed patio space and parking lots or parking spaces as of this month. And so we'll be seeing more of that. I think there's a bigger vision in the Vision Zero work, obviously, that we'll get to that. We have some other communities that are doing that around our region, though, that are seeing really great results.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to this earlier, but I was curious, obviously, again, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Columbus, Columbus is not a Rust Belt city. It is a white collar knowledge work town majority wise, which in this case is sort of perverse because, again, going back to the tax formulas, these are the kinds of areas, these are the kinds of jobs affected by remote work. So I know that some of the work you're going to do is going to have charging stations at employers. Originally, there was going to be, thinking about shuttles to employers. That's all now scrambled because there's no longer necessarily a need for commuting. So how are you thinking of in light of that? And what have local employers announced in that? I mean, we're seeing the announcements of banks in Manhattan and whatnot, but how are they committing to their offices in Columbus?
Yeah, I mean, it's an evolving thing as well. There's phased approaches. Some of the phased approaches aren't, getting the participation rates. But in general, we're not seeing companies really commit to bringing their workers back until the first of the year. And that is on a reevaluation basis. So depending on numbers. And obviously, we have a very large university here with the Ohio State University, which impacts numbers. So I think it is very much a monitoring game, but when these companies decide to come back, they want to do it with the intention to not have to return, back home again. But I do think I've done a lot of calls with about 30 large companies here. There is definitely a cultural shift happening with how they see the work environment and the need to be in the office, and probably never returning to 100% all their employees working back in the office as was pre-COVID conditions, and probably more of a flexible work policy surrounding it. I mean, the benefit of this is obviously our emissions are at historic lows. Our traffic and congestion is very, very minimal. Safety on the roads, all of that. So there is a benefit to this, but I think there is a greater economic, community aspect to this that is definitely being sacrificed. And if we can find some type of a balance, that would be great. We have been working with our companies to try and keep them involved in the community. So, it's one thing when you leave your home and you can see what's going on every day. And when you're at home, we can start to get in these bubbles where it's just the truth is just within our world. And as our worlds shrink, or we see biased media, that can be a huge filter to really understanding the severity of the issues and building empathy for the different situations that are experiencing. So we've built kind of a skilled volunteering effort that's totally virtual through COVID to bring about innovative solutions. And we've been able to engage a lot of our companies in that so that they can help nonprofits respond to the increasing demand for services in more virtual and digital ways.
Interesting. Have you seen it? I would say one of the things I'm tracking, and I'm curious if you've seen it as well, is the rise, of course, of all these mutual aid networks of community and neighborhood efforts that all spring up simultaneously. And this is something, in the literature, if you look at history, it either, there's efforts that go back to like the Black Panthers. And then, of course, there's, Hurricane Sandy and Katrina created efforts like this. But now we've had this huge simultaneous disaster in all these groups, and they've all had to be digital first because of contagion. Are you seeing that in Columbus, and are you supporting it, and how can you support it?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially exactly what we built. So it's called Can't Stop Columbus, and it was built, essentially it was an idea that I put out on Twitter, and a bunch of people kind of rallied around it. In about 2 weeks, we've had 1,700 people become a part of it. And so we're 6 months in now, and about 56 project ideas have been mobilized around and formed teams, and 20 some have launched apps, like data visualization and maps for Columbus City schools, helping, working parents with kids at home with our science museum. So a bunch of really different, like a totally different spectrum of support. But it's been, I think, it's completely virtual. Most people are total strangers, and they're just coming together because they want to help. I think it's been interesting in this moment. I can think back to when I was a student in college or growing up in high schools, there was a lot of mass shootings. And so in that area, we came together through crisis by physically being together and doing vigils and memorials and building a sense of community by sharing physical space. And I think what's really interesting about this virtual world is trying to build a sense of community without ever being together. So I think it's pushing the lines of communication, coordination, empathy building, all of that. And it's a prolonged engagement, which it's not, a moment of response from one crisis event. It's a ongoing effort. So it's been interesting to watch it become normalized in the psyche of the community, where it went from, this was a huge, burst of momentum, burst of interest, and deep engagement. Then people kind of got fried out. Summer happened. They wanted to go enjoy their time with the family and, in the nice weather. And now things are starting to get real again, and we're preparing for hibernation winter. And so we're seeing some people try and reprioritize what's important to them. And it's been really interesting kind of watching while the crisis is actually mounting all the time. It's almost become, less of a burning platform because people have started to normalize it. And it's a very fascinating psychology to watch unfold in this instance.
Yeah. Well, I guess the last question then, because we're almost out of time then, is once the pandemic is over, how do you hope to capture that energy and keep those relationships together? Because that's one of the things I'm exploring too. Normally, I mean, if you look at past disasters or like efforts like Occupy Sandy, they are combinations of volunteers physically organizing food and doing things and digitally, but they also faded away. I mean, for various reasons there. So persistence is a key to this. I'm curious how you hope to achieve persistence of these efforts, given the psychological burnout you just aptly described.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of our greatest challenges. And if you can bottle it up, that could be the biggest opportunity for the community. If you can add capacity to solving problems differently, inevitably you're going to be in a better position. So how do you do this? And so I think one of our considerations is really on this smart city journey, how critical is this crowdsourced community to fulfilling that? And can this be something that we help preserve that persistence, right, as part of the mission? Because I think, volunteers are going to be pulled in all different directions. So how can we empower the volunteers to give when they can, to the degree that they can? And I think that's the key to all of this, is the support structure that allows people to have a place to plug in and meaningfully. And then I think the second is, how do we make people exposed to the realities of the problems? I think the why is constantly urgent, but we just can't handle all of that urgency. Like, we don't have the mental bandwidth or the capacity. So how do we convey that to people that compels them to donate their skills and talents to where the community needs them most? And so I think that's another kind of storytelling and empathy building, frankly, an empathy building activity that we need to do as a community.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jordan. It's been a pleasure catching up.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, great. Well, for those of you, for our viewers here as well, our next episode, we're going to have a very special episode next. We're going to do a live taping, I guess before a live studio audience, with Madeline Ashby, co-author of the new book, How to Future. So she's going to be joining me at noon Eastern time on September 23rd. You're welcome to join in then, or we'll be posting this to YouTube as always. But if you want to ask her questions, you can then join. There's a Zoom registration link that we'll be able to find associated with this episode, and you can join us then. So until then, thanks again to Jordan for joining us, and I hope to see you all in the live studio audience on the 23rd.